My name is Hugh Edwards and I'm an economist at Loughborough University. I specialise in international trade theory and trade policy and a bit on trade empirics. And in fact, over the years I have done policy work, particularly regarding the external relations of the European Union. Now, obviously the Brexit debate is an extremely interesting time for anyone interested in the field. I think we probably all have fairly strong views on this, but I think it's important to ask a number of questions before we get into it. I mean, there are lots of supposed experts putting themselves up and possibly presenting numbers in the newspapers, in Parliament and so on. Some of them, it has to be said, are not people who have really worked on international trade. And I think it is important to bear that in mind. This is a rather specialised field of economics. It's also, in many ways, a very fundamental field of economics. You can go back to Adam Smith and say, well, individuals trade amongst themselves in order to benefit from specialisation. And then David Ricardo took this future with specialisation among different economies, different countries trading with each other. And he showed in many ways the benefits of trade. Now, there are a number of different viewpoints, political economic viewpoints, which we can discuss. And I think it's worth listing a few of those viewpoints and trying to think, well, what kind of theory underlies them? The first, which I think is really not grounded in economic theory, is the idea of autarky, which still has its followers, perhaps particularly among sort of anarcho-syndicalists and the like, people who perhaps haven't learned from Pol Pot and Kim Jong-un. People who believe that the country is somehow stronger and cleaner and more dignified, producing everything for itself. It has to be said, I don't think history is on their side, and economic theory certainly isn't. I don't think these arguments are highly significant in the Brexit debate, and therefore I will pass them by. However, there are more subtle views, people who believe, in a sense, in trade intervention in a large scale, what you might call protectionists and neo-mercantilists. People who believe that individual groups within an economy should be protected strongly against external threats. That is a popular view, especially during periods of recession. And we're seeing, in a sense, repetitions of these arguments now in the United States with the campaigns of Donald Trump and at the other extreme Bernie Sanders, and in France, of course, the National Front. People who effectively believe that they can protect the jobs of individuals and groups within their countries by keeping imports out. Yes, you can do that. And in fact, it's well worth considering what happens if you do that. Lots of jobs, for example, if you look around Leicestershire, have been lost through the closure of textile plants. These plants have closed because, in a sense, they are being undercut by imports from Bangladesh. Textile plants now employing workers earning very little and selling jeans which can be bought here at £5 a pair. Now, yes, you can prohibit those imports, but it's going to push the price of jeans right up. £40 perhaps instead of £5. It's also, the alternative to that is that, of course, British workers would be driven down to Bangladeshi wages, which I don't think is going to happen. Beyond that, though, there are more subtle forms of mercantilism which needs to be recognised and can't be dismissed out of hand. Views which argue that a country should put its own position first, that trade deals are always a bargaining thing and the aim is always to get the best out of a deal by doing the others down. This has a very sort of zero-sum view of trade negotiations, of course. The idea that you can only make yourself better by making someone else worse. And I think that that is potentially a danger. I'm going to move on fairly quickly and discuss a couple of other viewpoints. So the third viewpoint which I want to discuss is what you might call the unilateralist viewpoint. And the unilateralist viewpoint is one which says, I don't care what other people do, I'm going to adopt free trade. Now, you got to be a little bit careful on that, because of course it doesn't mean free trade in the sense for all your firms, because free trade should mean free access to other people's markets, and that in a sense takes two to tango. So if other people are not playing ball, if other countries are engaging in protection, the question is it still in your interests to engage in free trade? And this does require both understanding of trade theory and of trade empirics. Now, let's say that a whole school of trade theory grew up, which would have actually said, even in those circumstances, you should engage in unilateral free trade. I'm going to look at this in more detail in a future blog, but basically, there is a view which says a country cannot alter the prices of its imports or exports if that country is small. Therefore, if it imposes any kind of tax or tariff, all it's doing is raising the prices its own people face. And on the whole, this creates more of an economic loss than an economic gain, so you wouldn't want to do it. The only exception to that will be where a country is seen as large. Now, I'm going to challenge that later on, because it turns out that the theory behind it is a bit unrealistic. They haven't really questioned the idea of what large and small mean, and certainly the empirics don't stack up in favour of that type of view. Certainly people who make policy prescriptions based upon it are sticking their neck out and saying things which are not supported. So, to go on a bit further, basically I think most modern trade economists are what you might class as realists. And the basic idea of a realist is to understand that trade is good, that it's something we want to encourage, but that unilateralism in trade is not such an attractive thing. In other words, it's not always in my interests to cut tariffs or other forms of protection if I don't get something in return. So in one way you could actually see this as being an intermediate step between the sort of neo-mercantilists, the I must screw my neighbours in a deal, and the unilateralist view that if I cut tariffs, well, I'm not going to lose, a few vested interests within my country will lose for a while, but everyone's going to be better off. It's more realist. It's different to that. It's saying that actually trade is good, but you need to engage, and you need to actually negotiate positive trade deals with other countries. Now, ironically, the people who believe in this are grounded in what you might call new trade theory models, and in many cases, actually, these models producing bigger gains for trade, in fact, much bigger gains for trade, than the older style models which the unilateralist people use. The difference is that they have a particular feature, and that feature is what you might call the prisoner's dilemma. So the prisoner's dilemma was thought up in other circumstances. It's a well-known game theoretic representation of a game where it's in two prisoners are arrested. The police know they're both guilty of a minor charge, let's say possession of a firearm, but they need them to testify, one of them to testify against the other in order to get a conviction for a more serious offence, which is armed robbery. Now, the prisoner's dilemma works out that by offering king's evidence or queen's evidence to one person to testify against the other, that they can get them to do so. And it's in each person's individual interests to testify against the other. The irony is, had they been able to cooperate, collaborate, they could have done better because they would have both pleaded not guilty and they'd have both got out with a lighter sentence. So how does this apply to trade? Well, it applies in a very obvious way, because what we're saying is individual countries actually often have reasons, valid reasons, why they, and we'll discuss this in future blogs, valid reasons why they may want to impose tariffs or other forms of protection on each other. But collectively, they're much better off if they lower them. So trade realism is very much about finding means, negotiations, setting rules of games and so on, in order that you can gradually engage countries and actually get them to do things which are individually against their interests, but jointly in their interests. And that is very much the viewpoint of modern trade economists. That we're working to get countries to agree, we're working to get countries to develop international systems of agreement, interlocking treaties and so on, which make it harder for countries actually to withdraw and start hurting each other. So in many ways, I would say that I'm coming from a viewpoint where you can beggar your neighbour, but we're much better off if we both agree not to do it. And that's very different from the unilateral view, as I say, the unilateralist view of what people who might perceive themselves as being ultra-free traders is to say, well, it's actually a trivial game. It's in nobody's interest to impose a tariff on anybody else. If others do, they're being silly. It doesn't affect what I do. As I say, that actually, well, the people who propose this would like to be perceived as free traders. In many ways, they're standing against the liberalisation of trade because they're not really engaging with other countries in a way that might encourage them to negotiate lower trade barriers. So sometimes the best, if you want, can be the enemy of the good.